need to leave, Maren, and don't come back." Those were the exact words. Not "I don't love you." Not "this isn't working." 7 words, flat and cold, like he was telling her the kitchen was out of coffee. And the worst part, the part she kept turning over in her head for weeks afterward, was that he didn't even look at her when he said it. Maren set down the suture kit she'd been restocking and stared at the wall of her clinic for a long moment, the memory hitting her like it always did. Sudden, uninvited, right in the middle of something ordinary. She blinked it away. She had a patient in room 2. She had a daughter at school who needed picking up at 3. She did not have time to fall apart over a man who had made his feelings perfectly, brutally clear 11 months ago. She'd built this life. That was what she told herself every morning when the alarm went off at 5:30, and she made coffee for 1 and packed a lunch for 2 and drove 20 minutes to open the small urgent care clinic she'd spent 6 years building in Ashford, North Carolina. A real town, a quiet town, the kind of place where people actually waved at you in the grocery store parking lot. After growing up in Charlotte and spending her residency in Atlanta, the quiet had felt like a gift. She had not expected to fall in love with anyone in Ashford. She especially had not expected to fall in love with Nikolai Vance. She'd met him in February 2 years ago. He'd walked into her clinic at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, before they officially opened, because the door had been unlocked and he was bleeding through a kitchen towel wrapped around his forearm. Her receptionist wasn't in yet. Maren had been making the coffee. "We're not open," she'd said. "You are now," he'd said, and sat down in one of the waiting room chairs like he owned the place. She'd stitched him up herself. 8 sutures, clean cut, no tendon damage. She'd asked what happened, and he'd said a broken window, and something about how he said it told her that was technically true, and also not the whole story. She hadn't pushed. She was a doctor, not a detective. She'd told him to come back in 10 days to have them removed, and he'd said fine. He came back in 8. After that, she couldn't have told you exactly how it happened. He started stopping by. Coffee first, just dropping 1 off for her at the front desk, and 1 for her receptionist Greta, because he was like that. He remembered people. Then dinners. Then the kind of evenings that turned into mornings without either of them quite deciding to let that happen. She knew he had money. The kind that doesn't announce itself. No flashy car, no designer watch, just a certain ease with the world, the way certain men move through spaces like the spaces were built for them. He'd told her he was an import-export. She'd later understood that was a simplified version of a complicated truth. She'd met his driver before she met his friends. She'd noticed the security camera installed outside his downtown loft before she noticed the gun he kept in the nightstand. When she finally asked about it, he'd looked at her with those dark eyes and said, quietly, that he had enemies and that he needed her to trust him. And she had, because by then she was already in love with him, and love makes idiots of even intelligent women. She should have paid more attention to the nightstand. Her daughter's name was Phoebe. She was 5 years old and fearless in the specific way that 5-year-olds are fearless. Not because they don't understand danger, but because they haven't yet learned to let danger stop them. She had Maren's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw, though her father had been gone since before she was born, and Maren didn't spend much time thinking about that particular chapter of her life. Nikolai had been careful with Phoebe at first, cautious in a way that Maren found unexpectedly touching. A man who controlled entire shipping routes through the Carolinas, visibly nervous about whether a 5-year-old would like him. He'd brought her a picture book about sea creatures the second time they met, because Maren had mentioned offhandedly that Phoebe was obsessed with dolphins. Phoebe had made him read it to her 3 times in a row, and he'd done it all 3 times, without complaint. That was the man she thought she knew, the man who opened her clinic door on a Thursday evening in March and stood in the waiting room doorway with his coat still on and his jaw set and said, "You need to leave, Maren, and don't come back." She didn't recognize him at all. It was like looking at a photograph of someone versus standing in front of them. The same face. Something entirely different behind the eyes. She'd asked why. He'd said it wasn't something he could explain. She'd asked if she'd done something. He'd said no. She'd asked if there was someone else, and something flickered across his face. The first crack in that terrible composure, and he'd said no, that wasn't it either. Just leave, please. And something about the please was what broke her, because he'd never said please like that before, like it cost him something. She'd left. What else do you do? The weeks after that were the kind of weeks that don't make it into the stories people tell later. No dramatic crying, no late-night calls, just the dull, relentless work of pretending to be fine. For Phoebe, for her patients, for Greta, who kept side-eyeing her from the front desk and very wisely not saying anything, she threw herself into the clinic, extended her hours, took on a second physician assistant to cover the load she was creating by filling every empty hour with work. She reorganized the supply room twice. She power-walked through the neighborhood after Phoebe went to bed until her calves ached and her brain finally got quiet. She did not let herself wonder if he missed her. That way lay a very specific kind of madness she couldn't afford. Then, 6 weeks after he'd ended it, she found the envelope. It was in her car, tucked under the driver's seat wiper, which made no sense because she'd been parked in her own locked garage. A plain white envelope with her name on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a single piece of paper with an address in Ashford, a storage unit facility on the edge of town, on Route 9, and a 5-digit number. Nothing else. She should have thrown it away. A reasonable person would have thrown it away. Maren sat in her car in the garage for 11 minutes staring at that paper, and then she took a photo of it with her phone and texted it to her friend Claudette with the message, "If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, give this to the police." Then storage was the kind of place that smelled like concrete and old cardboard, fluorescent lights humming overhead in the access corridors. Unit 417. The 5-digit number was the code for the keypad lock. It clicked open on the first try. Inside was a folding table, a lamp on an extension cord, and a large manila envelope sealed with a strip of packing tape. On the front, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, for Maren Cole. Open this only if something happens to Nikolai. She stood there in the cold storage unit for a long moment, heart doing something loud and complicated behind her sternum. Then she opened it anyway. Inside the manila envelope were 2 things. A smaller sealed envelope with the words "Read Second" written on it, and a USB drive taped to an index card. On the index card, printed in neat, even, evidence, federal case, protected witness list, names, locations, dates. This is why you are in danger. Her mouth went dry. She read the words again, then again. This is why you are in danger. Not he was in danger. Not Nikolai is in danger. You. She opened the second envelope with hands that were not entirely steady. It was a letter in Nikolai's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. Angular, deliberate, the way he wrote grocery lists and left notes on her kitchen counter. But this was 4 pages, dense, and it started with Maren. If you're reading this, I wasn't careful enough, and I'm sorry. She read the whole letter standing up in that storage unit, the lamp casting a pale yellow circle around her. The door still open behind her because she hadn't been able to make herself close it. The short version was this. Nikolai had, for the past 3 years, been cooperating with a federal investigation into organized crime across 3 states. The import-export business was real. The other business, the one that had gotten him recruited as an asset in the first place, was also real, and it was not something he was proud of, and he had spent 2 years trying to get himself and the people who depended on him out of it. He had a handler. The case was close to trial, and 6 weeks ago, someone inside the operation had discovered his cooperation. That was why he'd ended it with her. Not because he didn't love her. The letter was extremely clear on that point, in a way that made her chest ache, because it was so plainly, helplessly sincere. He'd ended it because the people who were looking for ways to hurt him had started paying attention to her clinic, to the school where Phoebe went. He'd ended it to make her an irrelevant target, to create enough public distance that they'd stop watching her. And he'd done it the way he did everything that hurt, fast and clean, because he didn't trust himself to do it slowly. The envelope and the storage unit were insurance. In case something happened to him before the trial concluded, in case she needed to know why. She stood there for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, a car turned into the facility lot. She heard the engine, then heard it cut off, then heard footsteps on the concrete walkway, measured, unhurried. Maren folded the letter back into its envelope, tucked the USB drive into her jacket pocket, and looked around the storage unit for anything that could function as a weapon. Found nothing useful. Picked up the folding table's metal leg, which didn't detach, positioned herself behind the door. The footsteps stopped outside Unit 417. A voice said, "Dr. Cole." She didn't know this voice. "There's no reason for this to be difficult." The voice said, conversationally, the way someone might say the cafe is just around the corner. "We just need what's in that unit." She didn't answer. Her hand was tight around her phone, thumb hovering over the call button. "We know you have a daughter," the voice continued. "Phoebe, right? Kindergarten at Ashford Elementary. Gets out at 3. The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the temperature in the storage unit. "Okay," she said, keeping her voice level. Professional. The same voice she used when she had to tell people difficult things. "Okay, just give me a second." She hit the call button, not Claudette, 911, and then she shoved the storage unit door open as hard as she could. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not graceful. The man on the other side of the door was not expecting her to come out. He'd been expecting her to freeze. She'd had patience freeze, and she'd had patience fight, and she'd long since decided, in some clear-eyed corner of her mind, that she would rather be the kind of person who fought. She hit him with the door, got past him, ran toward the facility entrance. She could hear the dispatcher's voice on her phone saying 911, "What's your emergency?" And she said the address, storage facility, Route 9. "I need help. There's someone." She didn't finish the sentence because someone caught her arm from behind, a second man near the entrance, who she hadn't seen. She pulled against his grip, turned, clawed for his face with her free hand the way she'd learned in the self-defense class she'd taken 4 years ago and never thought she'd actually use. And then someone else hit him from the side and he went down hard, and she stumbled backward and looked up and found herself staring at a face she'd spent 11 months trying to stop thinking about. Nikolai was breathing hard. He had blood on his collar. She noted it the way she always noted injuries, automatic, involuntary, and his jaw was set the same way it had been the last time she saw him, except that this time, when he looked at her, his expression was not cold at all. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "Then what are you doing here?" "I've been watching the unit." He bent to restrain the man on the ground. Zip ties, she noticed, produced from his jacket pocket with the efficiency of someone who kept zip ties on their person as a matter of course. "When someone accessed the building, my contact alerted me." "Your contact?" She looked at him. "You had the storage unit under surveillance." "I've had the storage unit under surveillance since I set it up." He straightened, met her eyes. "I needed to know if you'd ever come here. I needed to know if you were safe." Sirens in the distance getting closer. She still had the phone in her hand. She could hear the dispatcher asking questions she wasn't answering. "The letter," she said. He didn't look away. "Yes. You didn't love me," she said. "That's why you left. That's what you let me think." "I know." His voice was quiet, the way it got when he was saying something that cost him. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, the man by the door was starting to come around. Nikolai glanced at him, then back at her, and she understood without being told that this was not over, that there were more of them, that the 40 seconds of chaos in this parking lot was a small part of something much larger. "Phoebe," she said, "I have someone with her. Right now. She's safe." The sirens were closer. 2 cruisers turned into the lot, lights going. Nikolai watched them come, then looked back at her, and she saw something in his face she'd never seen there before. Not in 2 years of dinners and mornings and intimate, difficult conversations. Something stripped raw. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. "Just tell me." The next several hours were the kind that required forms. Police reports and federal agents who appeared within 20 minutes of the first cruisers, flashing credentials and using words like ongoing investigation and federal jurisdiction and cooperating witness in tones that made the local officers step back deferentially. Nikolai's handler was a woman named Special Agent Diane Kraft, compact and efficient, with the kind of face that revealed absolutely nothing, and the kind of eyes that missed absolutely nothing either. She pulled Maren aside and explained, briefly, what Nikolai had already explained in the letter, and she said that the USB drive was important, and she was glad Maren hadn't handed it over, and she said that the trial was in 8 weeks and that after that, things would be different. Different how? Maren asked. Safer, Agent Kraft said. Like that covered it. Phoebe was brought to her by a young agent with a kind face who had apparently entertained her for an hour and a half by letting her look through his binoculars and teaching her to identify different kinds of birds. Phoebe was delighted. Maren held her daughter against her chest for a long time and breathed. Nikolai stayed on the perimeter of all of this, answering questions, signing things, doing what was asked of him with the same contained efficiency she recognized from the night she'd stitched up his arm. She watched him between all the other things she was doing, and she kept arriving at the same problem. She didn't know what to do with what she felt. Anger and grief and something else that she didn't have a clean name for, because love doesn't simply switch off when someone hurts you, even if they hurt you for reasons that, on reflection, she could understand. She was not ready to tell him she forgave him. She wasn't sure she was there yet. But when the last agent finally left and the lot was quiet again, and it was just the two of them and Phoebe, who had fallen asleep against Maren's shoulder, Nikolai came over and stood a few feet away and looked at her daughter with an expression that was not complicated at all. She asked the agent if the birds were her friends, he said. Quietly, so he wouldn't wake her. What did he say? He said yes. A pause. She seemed satisfied with that. Maren shifted Phoebe's weight. 11 months, she said. I know. You could have told me the truth. I know. He looked at her. I was afraid if you knew the whole truth, you'd stay. I was more afraid of you staying than of losing you. That was such a true thing for him to say that she almost couldn't stand it. That's a terrible reason, she said. It was a terrible decision, he said. I'm not trying to argue with you. She looked at him for a moment. He didn't look away. 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks until the trial concludes. After that, he stopped. After that, I'm done with it, all of it. I've been done for a long time, just not quite done enough. 8 weeks. Phoebe made a small sound in her sleep and burrowed closer, and Maren held her tighter and thought about all the math involved in deciding to trust someone again. It wasn't simple math. It never was. She'd done it once before with the wrong person, and she'd done it a second time with this person who she'd thought was one thing and had turned out to be a more complicated thing. And the complicated thing had still, somehow, built a schedule around dropping off coffee for her receptionist and learning the name of her daughter's favorite sea animal. I'm not forgiving you tonight, she said. I'm not asking you to. I'm going to go home and put Phoebe to bed, and I'm going to sleep for as long as she lets me sleep, which will probably be about 6 hours. And tomorrow morning I'm going to open my clinic and do my job. She watched his face. And in 8 weeks, when this is over, you're going to come find me. And you're going to explain everything, from the beginning, all of it. Something moved through his expression, quiet, careful, like he didn't trust it yet. Okay, he said. And I'm not making any promises about what happens after that. I know. But you can come find me. He nodded once, and then after a moment, he reached out and gently, carefully tucked Phoebe's hair back from her face where it had fallen across her cheek. The gesture was so tender and so unguarded that Maren had to look away. 8 weeks and 3 days later, the trial concluded. She heard about it on the local news, briefly. Federal case wrapped up, no names, vague reference to organized crime in the Southeast, moving on to sports at 11. She'd been watching from her living room with a cup of tea, and Phoebe curled against her side, and she turned off the TV when it was over and sat with the quiet for a while. The knock at her door came the following Saturday morning. She'd been expecting it, in the way you expect something you're not sure you're ready for. Phoebe answered it before Maren could get there, because Phoebe had no sense of self-preservation and the personality of a small, friendly hurricane. Maren heard her daughter say, "Oh, you're the man from Mama's photos," with the disconcerting confidence of a child who has been paying a great deal of attention to things adults assumed she missed. She came around the corner from the kitchen, and he was standing in her doorway with his coat on and a look on his face she'd never quite seen before. Uncertain, almost. Nikolai Vance, who had walked into her clinic bleeding and sat down like he owned the place, standing in her doorway looking uncertain. Phoebe had already taken his hand and was pulling him toward the living room to show him something on the coffee table. He let himself be pulled. Maren leaned against the doorframe and watched him crouch down to Phoebe's level to look at whatever she was showing him. A drawing, she could see now, one of the elaborate, chaotic drawings Phoebe produced constantly, this one involving what appeared to be a dolphin, and several figures standing on a dock. He said something she couldn't hear. Phoebe laughed. Maren looked at the two of them and thought, this is not simple. It wasn't going to be simple. There would be conversations they hadn't had yet, and things to rebuild, and 8 weeks of fear and anger that she would need to find some way to process in the presence of the person who'd caused them. That was the real work. Not the storage unit and the USB drive and the federal agents. Those were the event. The real work was everything after. But she'd done hard work before. She'd built a clinic from nothing. She'd raised a child by herself. She knew how to put her head down and do the thing even when it was difficult. She pushed off the doorframe and walked into the living room. Nikolai looked up when she came in, that uncertain look again, held carefully, like he'd been holding it for 8 weeks, and it had gotten heavy. She sat down on the couch across from him and her daughter. "Okay," she said. "From the beginning. All of it." The uncertainty eased just slightly around the edges of his face. "From the beginning," he said, and outside the living room window, a late November morning was going on, ordinary and unhurried, light coming in at an angle across the hardwood floor, Phoebe between them showing him her drawing with the complete confidence that everyone present was going to find it just as wonderful as she did. And for once, for the first time in almost a year, something in Maren's chest that had been clenched tight and still simply let go.